I came home to silence. Not the comfortable kind that settles over a house at the end of a long day, but the hollow kind that echoes when something vital has been removed. The kitchen table was bare except for an envelope with my name written in her careful handwriting. The same handwriting that had signed our wedding certificate, our mortgage application, every joint document that had bound our lives together. I didn't open it right away. I already knew what it would say. The signs had been there for months, small erasures of intimacy that I'd chosen to interpret as stress, as fatigue, as anything but the truth. The living room felt wrong. It took me a moment to realize why. The couch was gone. Not our couch, I suppose. Her couch now. The one we'd spent 3 weekends driving around to find. The one where we'd watched 1,000 movies with Cooper curled between us. The indentations in the carpet were still there, for perfect squares where the legs had rested for 7 years. I stood in the center of those marks and felt something in my chest compress, as if the air itself had become too heavy to hold. I walked through the rest of the house like a visitor in a museum of my own life. The bedroom, her closet empty, hangers scattered on the floor like discarded ribs. The bathroom, gaps on the counter where her things had been, the medicine cabinet half hollow. The garage. My car was there, but hers was gone, and so was the SUV we'd bought together last spring. I had co-signed for it. Of course I had. That's what husbands do. The worst part came when I called for Cooper. The silence that answered was different from all the other silences. It was alive with absence. I checked every room, already knowing, and found his bowls gone from the kitchen floor, his bed missing from beside ours, his leash absent from the hook by the door. She'd taken the dog. Our dog. The creature who had loved me unconditionally when I came home exhausted, who had slept with his head on my feet, who had been the only warm thing left in the house during those final frozen months. I finally opened the envelope. The letter was brief and precisely worded. Her lawyer had probably drafted it. She was filing for divorce. She had moved out for her emotional well-being. She would be in touch through her attorney regarding the division of assets. The house would need to be sold, of course, or I could buy out her half if I somehow found the money. She had taken Cooper because she'd be the one with stability, with the proper home to care for him. It was what was best. I folded the letter and set it on the counter. My hands were steady. I noticed that about myself. How calm I appeared, how my reflection in the darkened window looked almost serene. Inside, something was breaking, but it was breaking quietly, the way ice fractures deep underwater where no one can hear it. She'd miscalculated one thing, though she didn't know it yet. She'd taken everything she could see, everything she could inventory and claim and walk away with. But there was one thing she'd left behind, something she'd never valued enough to recognize. My patience, and the kind of clarity that only comes when you have absolutely nothing left to lose. I spent the first 3 days in that empty house like a ghost haunting his own life. I went to work, came home, ate meals standing at the kitchen counter because there was nowhere to sit. I slept on the floor in the bedroom with a sleeping bag I'd found in the garage, the one we'd used for camping trips that felt like they'd happened in someone else's marriage. The carpet still held the faint outline of where our bed had been, and I positioned myself carefully outside those marks, as if crossing them might break something that was already broken. On the 4th day, her lawyer called. A woman with a voice like polished steel, efficient and without warmth. She informed me that my wife, she used her name, Jessica, but it sounded wrong coming from a stranger's mouth, would need me to vacate the property within 2 weeks. The house was marital property, yes, but Jessica had filed for exclusive occupancy due to emotional distress. There were legal terms I didn't fully understand, documents being filed, proceedings already in motion. I asked if I could fight it. The lawyer paused, and in that pause I heard the answer. I could fight it, but fighting costs money, and Jessica had taken most of that too. I hung up and walked through the empty rooms one more time. The walls still held our wedding photos, though she'd taken the frames. The nail holes looked like small wounds. In the garage, I found boxes of my things she'd packed. Clothes, books, my tools, everything labeled in her handwriting with clinical precision. David, personal items. As if I'd become inventory. As if 7 years could be sorted into cardboard boxes and cleared out like a failed business. The apartment I found was the kind of place you rent when you need walls and a door and nothing else. 3rd floor, beige carpet, A kitchenette with 2 burners. The landlord barely looked at my paperwork, just took the deposit, money I'd borrowed from my brother, and handed me the keys. I moved in on a Tuesday afternoon, making 3 trips up the stairs with boxes while neighbors pretended not to watch. By evening, I sat on the floor of the empty living room and realized I owned almost nothing. A mattress arriving tomorrow. A folding chair. A lamp. The essentials of a life stripped down to its frame. That first night in the apartment, I couldn't sleep. The silence was different from the silence in the house. This one had no history, no weight. I lay on the sleeping bag and let myself remember things I'd been avoiding. How she'd started picking fights about nothing 6 months ago, manufacturing reasons to be angry. How she'd suggested marriage counseling, then canceled every appointment at the last minute. How she'd cried one night and told me she felt trapped, and I'd held her and promised we'd figure it out together, never suspecting that figuring it out meant she was already planning her exit. The manipulation had been surgical. I saw it clearly now, stripped of hope and denial. The refinancing of the house in her name because her credit was better. I'd signed those papers at the kitchen table while she stood behind me, hand on my shoulder, reassuring. The joint account she'd drained slowly, always with explanations. Repairs, Cooper's vet bills, her mother's medical expenses. I'd never questioned it. Why would I? You don't question someone you trust. That's the weapon trust becomes in the wrong hands. By the second week, something shifted. The apartment stopped feeling like exile and started feeling like a laboratory. I began to notice things with a clarity I'd never possessed when I was still inside the wreckage. I pulled out my laptop and started going through old files, old emails, old bank statements I'd saved without knowing why. Jessica had been confident, maybe too confident. She'd left traces everywhere, forwarded emails about property valuations, messages to her sister about finally being free, credit card statements showing charges at hotels in our city on nights she'd claimed to be traveling for work. I found her social media one evening and made myself look. She'd posted a photo of Cooper in what was clearly a new living room, expensive furniture, floor-to-ceiling windows. The caption, "New beginnings with my best boy." 43 likes. Friends calling her brave. But I zoomed in on the window reflection and saw a man's silhouette. I recognized him. Marcus, someone she'd introduced as a colleague at a company party last year. The way she'd laughed at his jokes. The way he'd watched her when he thought no one noticed. The timeline assembled itself like a puzzle I'd been too close to see. The late nights hadn't started recently. They'd started 18 months ago. The distance hadn't been gradual. It had been strategic. Every move had been calculated to position her for a clean exit while leaving me with nothing to stand on. She'd been building her new life while I'd been trying to save our old one. I started a notebook. Dates, expenses, screenshots, inconsistencies. Not for revenge. I didn't know what it was for yet. But my hands needed something to do, and my mind needed structure. I was good at details. I'd always been good at details. It was one of the things she'd claimed to love about me, back when love was still the language we spoke. One night I sat at the small table by the window and looked out at the parking lot below. My car sat alone under a flickering light, old and paid off. I'd lost the house, the savings, the dog, the marriage. But I still had time. I still had records. And I had something she'd never understood about me. I knew how to be patient. I knew how to wait. I knew how to read the fine print she'd always been too impatient to notice. The grief was still there, heavy and constant. But underneath it, something else was growing. Something colder. Something sharper. She thought she'd dismantled me completely, thought I'd fade into bitterness and never recover. But sitting in that bare apartment with documents spread across the table and her lies finally visible in black and white, I felt something I hadn't felt since the day I'd come home to that empty house. I found the lawyer by accident, or maybe by the kind of luck that arrives when you've stopped expecting it. His name was Richard Chen, and he worked out of a small office above a hardware store on the east side of town. I'd gone there to buy a drill, the apartment's curtain rods were falling down, and saw his sign in the window, "Family Law. First consultation free." I almost kept walking. Lawyers cost money I didn't have, and the word family felt like a knife I wasn't ready to twist. But something made me climb those stairs. Richard was younger than I expected, maybe 40, with tired eyes that suggested he'd heard every variation of human disappointment. I told him I wasn't sure what I wanted, that I probably couldn't afford him anyway. He listened without interrupting while I laid out the bones of it. The house, the refinancing, the drained accounts, Cooper, the way she positioned everything so cleanly before pulling the trigger. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. "You're not here for revenge," he finally said. "It wasn't a question." "No," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. "Good. Revenge is expensive and stupid. But leverage." He tapped his pen against his desk. "Leverage is something else. Do you have documentation?" I showed him what I'd gathered. Bank statements, emails, the refinancing paperwork I'd finally read in full. He went through it slowly, making notes, occasionally pausing to reread something. When he looked up, his expression had changed. "She made mistakes," he said. "Several of them." That meeting lasted 2 hours. Richard explained things I should have understood but hadn't. How marital property works, what constitutes financial misconduct, the difference between legal and ethical in divorce proceedings. He told me that fighting for the house would be expensive and probably futile, but that documentation of her draining the joint accounts could matter. That the refinancing papers I'd signed under pressure might have issues if I could prove I hadn't been given proper time to review them. He didn't promise miracles. He promised something better. A path. "I can't pay you," I said as we finished. "I know. But I'm going to take your case anyway." He saw my expression and held up a hand. "Not charity. Call it a percentage of whatever we recover. Plus, I'm divorced too, and your ex-wife's lawyer is someone I've dealt with before. She wins by intimidation, not preparation. I'd like to see how she handles an actual fight." I left his office that evening with something I hadn't had in weeks. A plan. Not a dramatic one, not revenge in any conventional sense. Just careful, methodical steps. Document everything. Say nothing publicly. Let her believe she'd won completely while we quietly assembled the full picture of what she'd taken and how she'd taken it. Richard was clear about the timeline. This would take months, maybe longer. Divorce moves slowly, and we had to be slower. Patient enough to let her mistakes accumulate, confident enough to wait for the right moment. The waiting became its own kind of discipline. I went to work each day at the accounting firm where I'd been employed for 6 years. My colleagues knew something had happened. They'd seen me lose weight, seen the exhaustion around my eyes, but I deflected their concern with vague phrases about personal matters. I never mentioned Jessica's name. I never posted anything online, never vented to friends, never gave her ammunition to paint me as bitter or unstable. I became invisible in the exact way she'd always accused me of being, but now it was armor instead of weakness. Meanwhile, she was everywhere. Her social media presence had bloomed into something performative and strange. Photos of Cooper at dog parks, at outdoor cafes, captions about healing and self-discovery and the courage it takes to choose yourself. Her friends flooded the comments with support, with praise for her bravery. She'd rewritten the narrative completely. She was the victim now, the woman who'd escaped a stifling marriage to someone who didn't appreciate her. I was never named, but I was present in every post as the implied villain, the dead weight she'd finally shed. I watched it all with the detachment of a researcher observing a specimen. Richard had told me to screenshot everything, so I did. The expensive dinners she posted from restaurants I could never afford. The weekend trip to wine country with Marcus, she tagged him now, openly, calling him my rock. The designer handbag that appeared in a selfie, the kind that cost more than my monthly rent. She was spending freely, visibly, as if the money was limitless. But I knew what our accounts had held. I knew what she'd taken. And I was beginning to understand that her confidence had made her reckless. Richard called me every 2 weeks with updates. We'd filed motions, requested documentation, pushed back on her lawyer's attempts to rush the proceedings. Every delay was strategic. Every request for records was calculated. We weren't just building a case. We were letting her build her own trap. The more she spent, the more she posted, the more she flaunted her new life, the clearer the pattern became. She wasn't just leaving a marriage. She was liquidating it for parts. One evening in late autumn, 3 months after she'd left, I sat in my apartment with Richard's latest email open on my laptop. He'd managed to get access to her credit card statements through the discovery process. The charges were staggering, not just restaurants and trips, but cash advances, transfers to accounts I didn't recognize, payments to furniture stores and electronics retailers. She'd been converting our liquid assets into possessions as quickly as possible, spending everything before it could be divided. But there was something else in the records, something Richard had highlighted in red. Several large payments to Marcus, labeled as loans. Except they weren't loans, they were transfers from the joint account I'd contributed to for 7 years. She'd been funding her new boyfriend with my money, and she'd been careless enough to leave a paper trail. I closed the laptop and walked to the window. The parking lot below was empty except for my car, salt-stained from the early snow. I thought about the house I'd lost, the dog I'd loved, the life I'd believed was real. All of it gone, dismantled by someone who'd looked me in the eye and promised forever. The anger was still there, sharp and bright, but it had transformed into something more useful. Something precise. She'd taken everything visible, everything she could carry or claim or photograph for social media. But she'd left behind the invisible things, the numbers, the dates, the digital fingerprints of her greed. She'd built her empire of a new life on the foundation of our demolished marriage, never suspecting that foundations keep records. That paper trails don't dissolve. That silence isn't the same as surrender. I picked up my phone and texted Richard, "When do we move?" His response came 30 seconds later. "Soon. Let her enjoy the holidays. January is when things get interesting." I set the phone down and looked at my reflection in the dark window. The man looking back was thinner, older, harder around the eyes. But there was something else there now, something that hadn't existed in the version of me who'd come home to that empty house 3 months ago. It wasn't rage. It wasn't even satisfaction. It was the quiet certainty of someone who'd finally stopped reacting and started playing the longer game. The first crack appeared in January, small enough that I almost missed it. Jessica's social media went quiet for 3 days, unusual for someone who'd been posting daily updates on her journey of self-discovery. When she finally posted again, it was a generic quote about resilience over a sunset photo, the kind of content that says nothing while trying to say everything. I screenshotted it and sent it to Richard with a question mark. His response: "Her accounts are frozen. Court order came through yesterday. She doesn't know we're the ones who requested it yet." The freeze was procedural, part of the asset discovery process, but its effect was immediate. Within a week, Jessica's posting patterns changed. The expensive restaurant check-ins stopped. The shopping haul photos disappeared. She posted more quotes, more sunsets, more pictures of Cooper with captions about how the simple things matter most. To her followers, it probably looked like growth, like she was moving beyond materialism. But I could read the subtext. She was running out of money. Richard had been right about the timeline. We'd waited through the holidays, let her spend freely, let her believe the war was over and she'd won. Then, in early January, we'd filed a comprehensive motion for forensic accounting of all marital assets. Every transaction from the past 2 years would be examined. Every withdrawal, every transfer, every credit card charge. Her lawyer had objected, of course, but the judge had seen enough irregularities in the preliminary documents to grant our request. The machinery of discovery was now grinding forward, slow and methodical and unstoppable. By February, the cracks had become fissures. I heard through a mutual acquaintance, one of the few who still talked to me, that Jessica and Marcus were having problems. The phrasing was careful, but the implication was clear. Money problems. He'd moved in with her, into that luxury apartment with the floor-to-ceiling windows, probably expecting to share a lifestyle that no longer existed. But frozen accounts don't pay rent. They don't cover car payments on SUVs that cost more than most people's annual salary. They don't sustain the kind of life Jessica had been advertising to the world. The rumors started quietly, the way they always do in small professional circles. Someone mentioned to someone else that Jessica had been asking about short-term loans. Another person heard she'd been late on a payment to a contractor. Nothing confirmed, nothing concrete, just whispers that accumulated like snow before an avalanche. I said nothing. I went to work, came home, ate simple meals in my small apartment, and waited. Richard called in mid-February with an update that made him sound almost gleeful. Her lawyer is pushing for a quick settlement. They want this done by March. Why? Because the forensic accountant is finding things. I don't have the full report yet, but there are inconsistencies. Transfers that don't match up with what she disclosed. Credit card debt she never mentioned. And those payments to Marcus? They're going to be a problem for her. How much of a problem? The kind where she might have to pay back marital funds she spent on a boyfriend during the marriage. Plus penalties. Plus my fees, if the judge decides she acted in bad faith. He paused. David, we might actually win this. I didn't feel victorious. I felt hollow, like I was watching a building collapse in slow motion and remembering that I'd once lived inside it. But I told Richard to keep pushing, to take whatever deal was best, but not to accept anything that let her walk away clean. She'd made this bed with surgical precision. She could lie in it. March brought the turning point. Jessica's social media presence, once so vibrant and performative, had shriveled to nearly nothing. When she did post, it was late at night. Rambling captions about betrayal and truth, about how people show their real faces, about how men use the legal system as a weapon. She never mentioned me by name, but everyone who knew us understood who she meant. Her friends still commented with support, but the numbers had dwindled. Sympathy has a shelf life, and hers was expiring. Then Cooper appeared on a local shelter's website. I found him by accident, scrolling through available dogs on a night when loneliness had gotten the better of me. His face was unmistakable, the white patch over his left eye, the way his ears folded slightly at the tips. The shelter's description said he'd been surrendered by an owner who could no longer care for him due to changed circumstances. No name, but I knew. I knew with the kind of certainty that lives in your bones. I called Richard immediately. She gave up the dog. There was a long silence on the other end. The one she claimed she needed for emotional support? The one she said you couldn't provide a stable home for? Yes. Screenshot everything. Send me the shelter listing, the date, all of it. This is. David, this might be what breaks the case open. She fought for that dog in the initial filing. Made you out to be unfit. If she surrendered him while claiming financial hardship, while spending marital assets on her boyfriend. He trailed off, and I could hear him thinking. This shows a pattern. Priorities. It shows what she actually cares about. I went to the shelter the next morning. Cooper was in a kennel near the back, thinner than I remembered, his eyes uncertain until he saw me. Then everything about him changed, his tail, his posture, the sound he made that was half whine, half cry. The shelter volunteer asked if I wanted to meet him in the interaction room. I said yes, and when they opened the kennel, Cooper nearly knocked me over. He pressed against my legs like he was trying to merge with me, and I sat on the floor and let him climb into my lap even though he was too big for it, and I held him the way you hold something you thought you'd lost forever. The adoption process took 3 days. When I brought Cooper home to the apartment, he walked through every room like he was checking for threats, then settled on the floor beside my mattress and fell asleep with his head on my foot. I sat against the wall and watched him breathe, and something in my chest that had been clenched for months finally loosened. Richard called that evening. Her lawyer wants to meet. Next week. They're ready to negotiate. What changed? Everything. The forensic report is damning. She spent over $60,000 of marital funds on Marcus and her new lifestyle. She falsified documents about the house valuation. She lied about her income in the initial disclosures. And now the dog, David, the optics are devastating. She claimed she needed him for stability, then dumped him when the money got tight. It makes everything she said look calculated. What do they want? To settle quietly. She keeps the house but refinances to buy out your actual share, at the correct valuation, not the lowball number she tried to use. She pays back half of what she spent from the joint accounts. You keep the car, the dog, and you walk away clean. No alimony on either side. It wasn't everything. It wasn't even close to what she'd taken from me in ways that couldn't be measured in dollars. But it was something. It was acknowledgement. It was the scales rebalancing, even slightly. "Tell them we'll meet," I said. After I hung up, I looked at Cooper sleeping on the floor. The apartment was still small, still mostly empty, but it didn't feel hollow anymore. Outside, the late winter sun was setting, painting the parking lot in shades of amber and gold. I thought about Jessica in her expensive apartment, about Marcus questioning their future, about her scrolling through her phone and seeing the engagement on her posts dwindling to nothing. I thought about how she'd built her new life on the wreckage of our old one, never considering that wreckage keeps receipts. She'd thought she could erase me, turn me into nothing more than a footnote in her story of liberation. But the thing about being underestimated is that it gives you room to move in the shadows, to work quietly while everyone else is performing loudly. She'd been so busy curating her narrative that she'd forgotten narratives need to be built on truth, or they eventually collapse under the weight of their own contradictions. I wasn't the same man who'd come home to that empty house 5 months ago. That man had believed in permanence, in promises, in the idea that love and loyalty were currencies that held their value. This version of me understood something darker and more useful, that everything leaves a trace, and patience is the sharpest weapon you can carry. The meeting took place in a conference room at Richard's office, neutral ground that felt appropriate for what was essentially a surrender. Jessica arrived 10 minutes late with her lawyer, a woman named Patricia Hendricks who wore her authority like expensive perfume, obvious and slightly overwhelming. Jessica looked different. Thinner, her hair pulled back severely, wearing a blazer I recognized from 2 years ago instead of something new. The confident woman who'd posted sunset wisdom and called herself brave was nowhere in evidence. This version looked tired and cornered. She didn't look at me when she sat down. I found that interesting, how someone who'd lived inside your life for 7 years could suddenly treat you like furniture, something to be worked around rather than addressed. Patricia opened her briefcase and began arranging documents with the careful precision of someone preparing for a performance they knew was doomed. Richard started simply. "We've reviewed the forensic accounting report. I assume you have as well." Patricia nodded. "We dispute several of the findings and believe the methodology." "You can dispute whatever you'd like," Richard said, his voice pleasant and immovable. "But the numbers are clear. $63,000 in marital funds transferred or spent on non-marital expenses. Property valuation documents that show one number to the court and a different number to potential buyers. Income disclosures that don't match tax returns. Should I continue?" Jessica finally spoke, her voice tight. "Those expenses were legitimate. The transfers to Marcus were loans that will be repaid." "Loans." Richard repeated the word like he was tasting something spoiled. "Documented how? With what terms? What interest rate? When are they due?" He waited, but she said nothing. "They're not loans, Jessica. They're gifts. Marital assets given to your boyfriend while you were still legally married. The court tends to frown on that." I watched her face change, saw the moment she understood that this wasn't going to be the quick settlement she'd expected. Patricia put a hand on her arm, a gesture that was probably meant to be calming but looked more like restraint. "My client made some financial decisions that, in retrospect, were not ideal," Patricia said carefully. "But nothing here rises to the level of..." Richard slid a document across the table. "This is the shelter surrender form for Cooper. Signed by your client 6 weeks ago. The same dog she fought for custody of because, and I'm quoting from her initial filing here, I have been the primary caregiver and have the stable home environment necessary for his well-being, while my husband's current instability makes him unsuitable." Jessica's face went pale. She looked at the document like it was evidence of a crime she'd forgotten committing. "I couldn't afford. The apartment doesn't allow. I didn't have a choice." "You had choices," I said. It was the first time I'd spoken, and everyone turned to look at me. "You chose the expensive apartment over a place that allowed dogs. You chose to keep spending money on furniture and trips and Marcus instead of taking care of an animal you claim to love. You made choices, Jessica. You just made the wrong ones." Her eyes finally met mine, and I saw something I'd never seen there before. Fear mixed with recognition. She was seeing me clearly for the first time, understanding that the man she'd dismissed as too passive to fight back had been quietly building a case while she'd been building a social media presence. "David," she started, but I held up a hand. "I'm not interested in your explanations. Richard, tell her what we want." Richard laid out the terms. Jessica would refinance the house immediately and buy out my half at the true market value, $40,000 more than she'd tried to claim. She would repay $30,000 of the marital funds she'd spent, structured as a payment plan if necessary but guaranteed against the house. I would keep the car, which was nearly paid off. I would keep Cooper. All claims of emotional distress or need for spousal support would be withdrawn by both parties. The divorce would be finalized within 60 days. Patricia tried to negotiate, but there wasn't much room to maneuver. The evidence was too clear, the pattern too obvious. After 90 minutes of back and forth, of threats about taking it to trial that everyone knew were empty, they agreed. Jessica would sign the revised settlement agreement within a week. As they stood to leave, Jessica paused at the door. She turned back, and for a moment I thought she might apologize, might acknowledge what she'd done. Instead, she said, "You've become cruel." I considered that. Thought about the months I'd spent in that empty house and then that bare apartment. Thought about calling for Cooper and hearing only silence. Thought about the careful way she dismantled our life while making me believe we were still trying to save it. "No," I said finally. "I just stopped being convenient." She flinched like I'd struck her, and then she was gone, Patricia's hand on her elbow, steering her toward the elevator. Richard and I sat in the conference room for a long moment after they left. "That was harder than I expected," I said. "The first look is always the hardest. When they see you as a person again instead of an obstacle." He started gathering his documents. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been holding my breath for 6 months and finally exhaled." I stood and walked to the window. The street below was full of afternoon traffic, people going about their ordinary lives, unaware that in this room something had just shifted, rebalanced. "It's not everything she took. It never is," Richard said. "But it's something. It's acknowledgement. It's justice, even if it's the small, mundane kind that happens in conference rooms instead of courtrooms." I signed the paperwork the following week. Jessica signed remotely, through her lawyer, which didn't surprise me. The refinancing took another month. She had to find a co-signer, I learned later, because her credit had taken hits from the late payments and mounting debt. Marcus didn't co-sign. That relationship had ended sometime in March, according to the mutual friend who couldn't resist telling me. Apparently, he'd had questions about where all his loan money had gone. The check for my half of the house arrived on a Thursday in May. I deposited it and sat in my car in the bank parking lot, staring at the receipt. It was more money than I'd had in months, enough to pay back my brother, to replace furniture, to start rebuilding. But it didn't feel like victory. It felt like closing a wound that would leave a scar, necessary, but not triumphant. That evening, I took Cooper to the park near my apartment. We'd been going there every day since I'd brought him home, establishing new routines in our new life. He chased a tennis ball across the grass while the spring sun hung low and golden. I sat on a bench and watched him run, watched his joy in the simple act of movement and play, and I thought about how different everything looked now. Jessica had wanted to erase me, to turn me into the villain in her story of self-discovery. She'd taken the house, the car, the savings, even the dog, everything she could inventory and claim. But she'd miscalculated the value of invisibility, the power of patience, the danger of underestimating someone who'd spent years reading fine print and remembering details. She'd built her empire on sand, and when the tide of scrutiny came in, it had dissolved. I wasn't the same man who'd stood in those carpet indentations 6 months ago, trying to understand how his life had been packed into boxes. That man had believed in permanence. This version understood that nothing lasts unless you build it on truth, on documentation, on the kind of foundation that survives examination. Cooper brought the ball back and dropped it at my feet, panting, expectant. I threw it again and watched him bound after it, all muscle and momentum and uncomplicated happiness. The apartment was still small. My savings were still recovering. The life I'd imagined having at this age was still gone, replaced by something smaller and harder one. But I was free. Free of her narrative, free of her manipulation, free of the person I'd been when I believed that loving someone meant accepting whatever version of reality they presented. The price of that freedom had been high. Months of silence, of strategic patience, of watching her stumble while resisting the urge to push. But the price of staying trapped would have been higher. She could keep her social media wisdom and her sunset quotes. She could rebuild whatever life she wanted, as long as it wasn't built on the ruins of mine. I had something better now, something she'd never valued enough to recognize. I had the truth, and I had the receipts to prove it. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday in late May. I signed the papers in Richard's office, thanked him, and walked out into spring sunshine that felt cleaner somehow. I didn't go straight home. Instead, I drove with the windows down, Cooper's head out the passenger seat window, his ears flapping in the wind. No destination, no plan. Just movement and air and the kind of silence that feels like freedom instead of loss. I ended up at a state park an hour outside the city, a place Jessica and I had never been. That mattered. New territory, no ghosts. Cooper and I walked the trails, and I sat on a fallen log watching light filter through new leaves. For the first time in months, I let myself feel it. Relief. Not happiness yet, but relief. The kind that comes when you finally put down something heavy you'd forgotten you were carrying. The money from the settlement changed things. I paid back my brother, cleared my debts, and found a townhouse to rent. 2 bedrooms, small yard, a kitchen where I could actually cook. I furnished it slowly, buying things because I liked them, not because they fit some image. A comfortable couch. Bookshelves I assembled while Cooper supervised. It stopped feeling temporary and started feeling mine. Work got better too. A promotion in April, a raise I needed. My boss said I seemed more focused. I didn't explain that focus is what happens when you stop bleeding energy into a dying relationship. I started running in the mornings with Cooper, 3 miles through the neighborhood, my breath and footfalls the only rhythm that mattered. The shelter called asking if I'd foster dogs. They remembered how Cooper had responded to me. I said yes. A beagle mix first, then a terrier, then an elderly lab who needed a quiet place for his final months. Cooper became the ambassador, showing scared dogs that humans could be trusted again. Watching him with the Fosters, still capable of love after his own abandonment, felt like a lesson I was supposed to learn. I drove past the old house once by accident. The lawn was overgrown, the flower beds choked with weeds. Jessica's car in the driveway, but the house looked neglected, trapped. The for sale sign was gone, she couldn't afford to move. I felt something close to neutral acknowledgement. Her consequences were hers now. I drove on and didn't go back. By August, I'd stopped checking her social media entirely. She existed somewhere in the city, dealing with her choices, and that was enough. I didn't need her to suffer. I just needed to be free of her, and I was. One Saturday, I took Cooper back to that same park. We walked to the fallen log, and I sat while he explored. I thought about the man who'd come home to silence a year ago, who'd believed his life was ending. That man had thought love meant absorbing pain to keep the peace. This version understood that love without reciprocity is just erosion. I didn't hate Jessica anymore. I just didn't think about her. She'd taught me that paper trails don't lie, that patience outlasts performance, and that the quietest response is sometimes the most devastating. But more than that, she'd taught me, accidentally, what I would and wouldn't accept anymore. Cooper came back and sat beside me, panting, content. We did okay, I told him. We survived it. But survival wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something else. Something smaller maybe, less dramatic than the life I'd imagined. But mine. Built on truth, earned through patience, not taken through manipulation. I stood and brushed the bark from my jeans. Come on, buddy. Let's go home. Home. Not a place she'd taken, but something I'd built in the aftermath. A townhouse with a yard, a dog who trusted me, mornings spent running, evenings spent quiet. A life that didn't need to be performed or proven. As I drove back through the summer evening, Cooper's head on my lap, I thought about that moment when Jessica had called me cruel. She'd wanted me to be the villain. But I'd simply stopped being the person she could use. She could keep the house. I had something better. Myself back. Not the version that existed before her, but the one forged in the quiet months of loss and rebuilding. Harder, less trusting, but clearer. More honest. More mine. The sunset painted the highway in amber and gold. I drove toward home, toward whatever came next. The past was settled, finished. And for the first time in a year, the future felt like something I actually wanted to see.